Hey there, friends. How's it going today? Time for a real talk. I guess, it's always a real talk, but there are quite a few things I want to talk about here. I'd like to start off by saying that I think there are a lot of misunderstandings between each other. And originally I was going to say that I am intending to make this video somewhat to try to achieve some sort of a solidarity between people who think that they oppose one another. The division is very high right now in society. But I thought about the term solidarity and it didn't really apply. I think the term might be more of a compromise. Emotions are running high right now. We all know that. This has been a crazy year. I think that for the most part, all of us want a better world for our children than we had. That has always been the mantra of the parent, to say, well, we may have faced hard times, but we want to leave the world better for those who come after us. Somebody pointed out the other day that we're living in a time now where people don't feel like the future is going to be there for their children. And because of this, there's a lot of hostility, there's a lot of frustration, and as the disparity in wealth has grown even more, people feel like they're completely ignored. Now, I'm trying not to ramble because I have some points I need to cover here, but I'd like to start by saying people are scared, but life is scary. For a lot of people, life has been relatively simple for them, and when they're faced with a crisis, they are often put in a position that others have been in many times before. I think that working together for a better future is important, and I also do believe in community, and I do believe in having enforcement of laws and regulations and rules that we all agree on. I think that a few of my subscribers had a misunderstanding of, for example, the video I made the other day. When I was covering the protests in Portland, just because I'm filming those things, and I went down there intending to film them, doesn't mean I'm necessarily against cops. It doesn't mean that I hate cops. And I'm going to get to that because I have some serious gripes with Antifa and this whole movement of ACAB, or all cops are bastards, or all cops are bad. And I'll tell you, I always speak my mind. When I went to Pioneer Square to do the initial protest where they were speaking at the loudspeaker, I was documenting, and some lady walks by and she goes, all cops are bad. And I said, I disagree. She stops and she's like, what? I said, I think that that's actually an ignorant comment because you're generalizing an entire group of people. And she's like, well, that's just like your opinion. And I was like, I know. And you gave me yours and I gave you mine. And the reason I bring that up is because I'm not the kind of person who hates cops. I've had a lot of bad run-ins with police in my life. I've had a lot of issues with government in my life. But it doesn't mean that I think we should just cast everything out and start over. I'm not an anarchist, okay? So, this year, what has compounded and brought this forward? I'll start with an unpopular opinion that I have. This is not about George Floyd. Now, instantly, there will be a lot of people who really are appalled by me saying that. And others who will say, yeah, it's not. Both sides are somewhat correct. George Floyd was just one guy. People are focusing on his history, his life. He was a criminal. He shot somebody. He was a drug dealer. He had fentanyl. None of this matters when you're talking about a death. You're talking about a match. You can talk about how that match was constructed before you threw it on the pile of kindling. But it's not going to do any justice to the fact that the kindling was ready to burn. You'd even thrown gasoline on that fire over several years through, many of these protests have been hijacked by other groups. And I'm going to get to that as well. We are approaching a serious hurricane season right now, which they expect are going to bring a lot of storms. And on top of that, we have COVID-19. In Africa, there's a locust invasion unlike anything we've seen in decades. And it's ravaging crops. The weather around the world, desertification, farm issues. We are facing some serious problems. And in order to save face in any way, shape, or form, we have to at least agree on a few basic principles, which means that we have to try to overcome the misunderstandings we have with one another. I compare what's going on right now to a house fire. Sometimes you can salvage the house, but even if it burns down to its foundation, you still have the foundation. There's a reason foundations are made of concrete. There are some concrete realities to the systems we've set up for ourselves. Even though people might say, oh, it's just a huge oppressive system that the government's all set up and it's all a new world order, Illuminati, conspiracy to rule people. This is in human nature. We have used a system that represents our human nature, which means that there are some people who are selfish and take advantage and others who really have strong empathy and care about others and want equality. And I'm somewhere in the middle, where I kind of hate to use this term, but I believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome, which is something that Jordan Peterson said, and I despise Jordan Peterson. But of course, I talked about that back in the day, where he appealed to a group of young men who felt disillusioned, who were sick of the bullshit out there. And the reason I say that is because, and bring that up and him up, is because there are groups of young white men who are pissed off at the world, who find somebody who resonates with them. There are groups of young black men who find somebody to resonate with, who think that violence is the answer. And then there's the Antifa group, the young thugs who stand out in the streets after dark and cause trouble. Now, I need to mention this first. I am not supportive of Antifa, but I am an anti-fascist. And when I went to the protest the other night, filming from back there, I remember, and I was there watching and listening and filming. I have several videos, at least a couple hours of footage that I want to eventually do something with. But we were filming people standing at the gate. Whenever somebody would shake the gate or throw something over the gate at the cops, there would be a dozen people that would scream, "Stop throwing shit! Stop throwing shit!" A lot, and a majority of the crowd, even during the late hours, were relatively peaceful people, a lot of them keeping in line those who were trying to kick over the gate. It's not enough. It doesn't matter. What happened, happened. They launched tear gas over us and into the crowd. I know that there are easier ways to deal with it. And also, I agree when people say, you put yourself in that situation. Yes, I did. But it was worth it. I needed to see for myself, We all sit at home and watch things on TV. That's a totally different story. But, so being down there and watching this, I see the troublemakers. I see the groups that are causing problems. And in Portland over the last several nights, this has gotten worse. Last night I watched protesters try to kick down the gate, and they responded with tear gas again. What do you expect? I totally agree with the people who are saying it's a bunch of white kids, young white kids dressed in all black who are pissed off at the world and trying to take out their anger on the cops. I could not agree more. I am of the mentality that I do not like fascism, but anti-fascism doesn't mean you burn your own community. I do not support looting. I do not support burning of businesses. And I'm appalled by a lot of the shit that's going on. But I also feel like people are focusing on that instead of the bigger picture. And as I said before, this isn't just about George Floyd. This is about years of oppression, decades of oppression from many groups. It does annoy me when somebody says, well, this is about more than George Floyd, and some very passionate people say, no, it's not. This is only about Black Lives Matter. I'll be honest, I think that's doing some damage to real change. If black people want to own this as their own, I think that that's doing real damage to the fact that white people are harmed too, that white people are killed too, that police abuse white people too. But why do we have to get to that level? Why do we have to get down to the point of white and black, and this is how many white people and black people are attacked, instead of saying, we need reform. And most people are just demanding reform. Even when you see signs that say defund the police department, defunding, they don't, a majority of people don't mean eliminate all funds for police at all. And that's a big misunderstanding. What they mean is take a portion of the money that they're spending on tanks and military-grade weapons and body armor that's, beyond what they need to protect themselves, and use that money to fund crisis management teams. People who can go in when somebody may have a mental illness and say, we're going to send in these guys. Because they're doing a really bad job at it. It's not about helping the community and getting people into treatment, whether it's for drugs or mental illness. And that's a serious issue in our society. Police kill people for drugs and mental illness at a huge rate in this country, of all races. And it's really disgusting to watch. And even if you completely support your police 100%, you can't deny the amount of people that are out in the street right now. So during this house fire, even if we burn it, even if it ends up getting burned to the foundation, we still have a foundation, and we need to build it back. We need to bring ourselves back to where we can get along again, because we're facing some really hardcore times right now. Oppression equals rage. Somebody commented the other day, they said, well, what would MLK think about violence in protests? He was a peaceful protester. It's total bullshit. Truth is, if you look at history, that was the white man's version of MLK. But my answer to the guy was, MLK agreed with peaceful protesting. And what happened to him? He was shot and killed, right? A quote from MLK was actually, he says, the riot is the voice of the unheard. It didn't mean he was condoning rioting. It didn't mean he was condoning violence. And he meant that if people are ignored in their own communities for any reason, and their voices aren't heard, the only voice they have is violence. This has been shown through history, you know. I feel like not enough people have a grasp on history and what really causes protests. The people who say protesters should just go home are people who have never had to fight for anything in their lives. Anybody who says that has probably never really needed to stand up for anything, because people protest when they're angry. Which brings us to COVID. The fact that so many people are protesting, in spite of the fact there's a pandemic going on, shows that people really feel strongly about it. And the interesting fact, when I was down there, is a majority, almost all people were wearing masks. And I think that people who are maybe conservative-minded might see this and say, look at all these people, they're spreading the virus, you know, even more. But a lot of people can't say anything because they're the same ones who denied the virus was a serious issue. So they're kind of stuck in this cognitive dissonance of, I can't tell them they're spreading the virus because I said it was a fake virus and it didn't matter anyway. It's some very interesting times that we're in, you know. People are in their virtue signaling and this is what I believe and this is what I believe. I get accused of virtue signaling as well. No, I have my own values, but I don't virtue signal. I stand by what I believe and I do what I do. Throwing things at cops and yelling at cops and saying they all suck does not solve the problem. I'll just put it that way. Burning down your neighborhoods and your local businesses does not solve the problem. So if anyone out there who is in the group of Antifa, consider your actions before you're an idiot. But I'd also like to say the people on the right are equally foolish. In Klamath Falls, down south from where I live, my brother sent me this article. There have been a lot of false rumors spreading on social media about Antifa sending busloads of members to these small towns to supposedly, as the quote was, take out the white hoods, like as in neighborhoods. The obvious thing my brother pointed out is this was obviously written by somebody who is completely out of touch of how the language that people use on the left, and so nobody says white hoods. That's something that the people, the actual white supremacist groups would say, and there is evidence that white supremacist groups are spreading false information claiming to be Antifa. So, point being, in Klamath Falls, a couple hundred protesters showed up, just to stand and say Black Lives Matter. A huge counter-protest group of like 300 or 400 people, I think, showed up across the street, carrying their assault weapons, totally dressed in their fatigues, showing off their power. In the end of the night, Antifa never showed up, of course. It was a fake post. They said they were going to drop off pallets of bricks. I mean, I've heard my subscribers telling me this. Antifa's going to drop off pallets of bricks. Please, do your fucking research. Don't just read the internet claims and Twitter and say, oh, this is what's happening. Antifa, to make a point, is not an organization. My brother pointed this out. An organization has a leader and is organized. Antifa is a loose collective of people who have their own interests at heart, and I do not support anarchism in the way that they perceive it. But the fact that so many people showed up to counter-protest, a few fights ended up breaking out, and the charges were mostly against, I guess, the other side, not against the protesters. Most protesters are peaceful. I went on my local protest yesterday. It was a drive. It was like 1,500 cars all the way down my street, all the way down to downtown Vancouver. And it was about a 2-hour, it was a very slow drive. Like my wife said, it's the first time I've never heard you complain about traffic. Because we were stuck in a line, and that was the whole point of it. And we peacefully drove through, said what we had to say, and we went home. Naturally, there were a few people in the crowd downtown who had signs that said all cops are bad and bastards, cops suck, defund police. Not everybody stands by people who hate police. I really need to make that point. Where do I go from here? Stores, masks. I wanted to make a point that a lot of folks use Antifa to say all protesters are somehow Antifa, or look at what this is causing. That would be the same as me saying, well, the few angry right-wingers who have gone into a store and punched a clerk or said I refuse to wear a mask, right? Because the COVID issue. There has been a lot of violence over that. It's not really about the COVID issue or masks. It's because people are upset. But if I used a few actions of those on the right to justify how I feel about everybody on the right, I'd be an idiot. I'd be stereotyping a whole group. I don't do that. I'm not left or right. I am an independent thinker. And it's really hard to explain that to people. I feel like I can't even talk about anything Trump says because people get upset. To make it a point, I'd like to apologize for anyone who was truly offended over the years by me, anything I said specifically, that may have bothered them politically. But they say I'm a Trump hater, that I have Trump derangement syndrome, even when I just mentioned something that he said. And almost every person who's been angry at me about that has said, well, you're just following mainstream media. I say, no, I follow his own Twitter feed. I watch what humans say. I watch what they do. I don't watch what other people say about them. I don't fucking watch journalists. I don't watch opinions on CNN. I never watch that shit. I read the articles. I do the best I can to assess what's going on. But my issue with, say, Trump is about more than just how he talks or who he is. But I understand why people voted for him. They wanted to fucking stir up the system. I get it. The system is broken. And somebody accused me the other day. They said something like, "Your hero, Biden." I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Biden is a complete moron. This is worse than Hillary almost. They're both complete shitbags. The Democratic Party is failed completely. But so is the Republican Party. They have both failed the people. That's why we need solidarity. That's why we need to come together over this shit. There are deep institutional failures that all of us are affected by. But a lot of people don't realize it. Even those who are comfortable and doing well, who say, well, my life's fine, you could be doing better, You could be doing better. And it's not for lack of trying. It's because people have been oppressed for a long time and forget that the government works for them. And for anyone who thinks this is just about one guy still, there are worldwide protests. Germany, Paris, it goes on. Japan, places you would never expect. And in solidarity, but also in agreement with their own problems, for their own authority. Authoritarianism has been a problem for a long time, so even those on the right who have talked about too much government, they should be completely in solidarity with those who are protesting against overpowered government. It's a really weird time to be alive. I think there's a lot of propaganda, out there. And I feel like a dictator is not a leader of a free country, which is, as I said, the reason why I don't like Trump. But dictators are not leaders. People who try to force those by fear to submitting are not leaders. They're dictators. And I feel like folks can't see through that, so I'm not going to sit and talk about it all day long. The mainstream media on the left just sits and obsesses over Trump. I wish they would just ignore him and move on. As somebody said, the president has become irrelevant now. That's how I feel personally. I don't need a guy speaking for me. I know how I feel. The people know how they feel. And they're out in the streets saying as much. Everybody has their own opinion, but I don't need a boss, okay? A lot of people like having a boss, and I realize I've been political for a while. Everything I've talked about in the last couple of weeks has been about COVID or protests, but what else do you talk about? Through my whole life, I've talked about what affects me at the moment. You know, usually when I come up with a subject, it's something that I'm, charged about or something that I read about and learned about. But when you're immersed in a culture of chaos, how can you sit and talk about rainbows and unicorns, I just think it's important we don't lose the bigger message here, which is that we need systemic change. And that means that we can't just make this, at this point, about Black Lives Matter, or about White Lives Matter, or about left, or about right, or up or down, or any of this bullshit. People are frustrated. They are marching for many different reasons, but mostly because they're sick of a system that oppresses people. It's not just police, it's military, oppressing other countries. Something we don't see unless it's on television, but the media doesn't cover war anymore. They don't talk about all the civilians who die. It's too gross and too drastic, We'd rather talk about whether the fucking Queen said something or spoke publicly for once, or, oh no, the prince and the princess are moving to Canada. Celebrity culture is what's destroyed us, really. And it's a big part of it. The fact that we look to these people instead of, for guidance, instead of finding our own. Hollywood, idolizing actors and actresses. A lot of them are just morons. Why do we care what they say on Twitter? But that brings me to the point here. Why would I care what the president says on Twitter either? Because he's just another person. He's not smarter or better than anybody else, just a human being that was hired to represent the people and decided to not to, I guess. And so this is a bigger issue than I think a lot of people are admitting. And one of my biggest issues is a lot of folks are talking about their Second Amendment rights, say the Boogaloo groups, people who are afraid they're going to lose their guns, cops are going to come take their guns, they're going to come door to door somehow and take everybody's guns. And I used to think this was just a few people, just a joke, but apparently a lot of people in the South really talk about this regularly. They are waiting for the day when, and this was written by somebody who lives down in Texas and sent it to a show I was watching, and he said, where I live, rarely a conversation comes up at a bar or at the feed store where they aren't talking about the day that they come to take our guns. And I understand that a little better now. The reality, of course, is that nobody's ever going to take Americans' guns. But let's just say there was a plan to do that. And many people have tried, of course, and this is understandable why people are pissed off about losing their weapons. But I just wanted to point out that I totally support the right to bear arms and protect your own property and livelihood. I also believe in a free press. And there are a lot of people I've talked to who are Second Amendment supporters who actually support going after the press because the president says the press is the enemy of the state. And I'd like you to know, the press are protected by a First Amendment right, which came before yours, before the second. You know what I'm saying? It's hard not to seem like, kind of cocky about it, but a First Amendment right is a First Amendment right. The right of a journalist to cover what's going on. If you don't agree with it, that's fine. You can change policies, bring back the fairness doctrine, whatever you want to do. But in the meantime, we have to deal with the reality that the press has a First Amendment right to be there, and cops have been punching them and harassing them. And I've heard people saying, well, that's what they get for being fake news. Just want people to consider that for a minute. And if we ended the drug war tomorrow, just cut a lot of the police brutality and problems down. If you weren't allowed to harass someone for possession of drugs, if we had accountability for all people, if police were investigated not by their own or other cops or, the DA, but, citizen groups, there are so many things that we can do to improve this, but it goes so far beyond police. We all know this. The police are at the will of the larger government, which is the big problem. It is the big problem. there's not much else I can really say, I guess. I just wanted to clarify how I feel about things. I am not a supporter of Antifa. I'm not a supporter of violence against small businesses. I did mention the other day that I really have no feelings for the looting of Wall Street or Fifth Avenue. And it's because these are larger companies that are making billions of dollars selling $1,000 Coach purse or something. I have a hard time feeling sorry for the commercialized world. If you're harming somebody's food supply or somebody's mom and pop business, that's a different story. But I think that making an impact with corporations, even though it's disgusting, somebody still has to pay for it. In the past, people, if their voices aren't heard, they use violence instead and destruction. And that's why we have to listen to voices, so people don't feel the need to do that. As I said, there's a deeper existential issue going on, a major crisis. And when it unfolds completely, we might see results. Well, we will see results. We might see something change for the better, or we might just be at the very end right now, just working our way into, destruction. I mean, I think it was yesterday I read an article that during all this going on, the Trump administration signed an order removing environmental protections on waters off the coast that were like protected habitats, allowing drilling in refuges, basically just saying we want the economy to boom, so therefore we're going to remove protections on the environment and get to work, get to drilling, get to fishing. And I'm not saying I can't agree or disagree. I'm still pondering this, but what I wanted to say was that as long as we aren't, as long as we're just trying to make money, we're really missing the point of being alive. And we've bought into that paradigm from Jekyll Island, the fiat currency system, which then just gets into deeper and deeper things and goes back to 2008 with all the people who were protesting Occupy and all the people who basically ended up leaving that, and then all the people who stayed behind, and a lot of them were troublemakers. And it becomes this same thing of a huge group of people who have an issue and a small group of people who are, say, causing trouble, destroying things. It's very difficult to talk about. Telling all protesters to go home won't work at this point. There's a lot going on out there and a lot of people who feel very passionately about change. So hopefully I didn't divide any more here with this, because I did bring up Trump, but I had to cover that. I don't hate the guy. Okay, I hate the guy. But he's not the first president, I made t-shirts about George Bush when he was president because of 9/11 and going into war, saying this is going to be a war that lasts forever. My friend says, nah, it'll be over in a few weeks. Well, we all know where that ended up, so we can do better as a society. I can't imagine the left and the right coming together. There are plenty of people who want a civil war. They want destruction. I think that's the Boogaloo group. That's their whole point, is to cause division in a civil war. And regardless of how you feel about things, a war between citizens doesn't solve anything unless you really have a good enough point to stand for. And so far I haven't seen one. So thanks for listening. I think I covered everything I wanted to. Which side of history do you want to be on? There's very few movements through history that haven't been noble and haven't ended up being looked upon as, wow, these people saw through the propaganda. I think a lot of people are figuring that out. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to y'all later.